if you like using long lenses but don't necessarily like to carry a lot of gear, one thing you ought to consider is a mirror lens, otherwise known as a catadioptric lens. These lenses come from the astronomy world, where this type of telescope is very prevalent. You'll find a lot of these. So let's get this onto the bench and take a closer look at it. So this is a fairly compact lens. It comes with a lens shade, which is good. It's just a simple screw-on lens shade. There's nothing extraordinary about it. And it's so simple that oh, there it is. I was going to say it's so simple I can't get it on. This does extend the length of it somewhat, but not that much when you consider this is a 500 millimeter lens. And so why would you select this over a regular optical 500 millimeter lens? And it's simply because of the weight. So by its nature, a telephoto lens can get very long. For example, this is a 200 millimeter tessar, and you can see compared side by side, just the 200 millimeters, you can see or already see how much longer this lens is compared with the 500 millimeter lens. So if you think about that being a 200 millimeter lens, you could really imagine how long a standard 400 or 500, 600, even 1,000 millimeter lens might be. These lenses often go by several names. This really is a catadioptric lens. Informally, it's often called a cat lens, short for, of course, for catadioptric. And you'll also hear it called a mirror lens, and of course that is because of the use of mirrors in its design. I've also seen this referred to as a reflex lens, although I think a mirror lens is probably an easier term to understand. So let's go ahead and weigh this lens. So this lens is 1 pound. Okay, not too bad. And so now let's take a look at the tessar. Remember, this is a 200 millimeter tessar. So this is 1 pound, 7.8 ounces, really 1.5 pounds. So this is a half pound heavier, I guess you could say, what, 50% heavier than the mirror lens, yet less than half of the focal length. Depending on what you photograph, this can either be the perfect choice or it can be the perfectly wrong choice of lenses. This particular lens uses what's called a T-mount. And so on the back, this is not a 42 millimeter screw mount. This is actually what's known as a T-mount. And it allows you to screw on any adapter, any T-mount adapter, and on the back you would then fit various camera mounts. Could be Nikon F, could be Olympus, Pentax, Pentax K, Minolta. I don't know if there was one for the Canon FD mount. Presumably there was. I just don't know. I'm sort of a big fan of the 42 millimeter screw mount because that can adapt to almost anything. You'll also notice one other thing. With this lens, you can use two filters. You can either use a screw-in filter in the front, and that's going to be a challenge. Well, those become very expensive to purchase because, as you can see, this is a 77 millimeter thread. So think of lots of money. The larger a filter gets, the more expensive it becomes. So instead, in the back, you can simply screw your filters in here. This happens to be a small skylight filter. And you can see it's slightly, used to be pink. I'm not sure if that's pink anymore. And the filter thread on this is just 30.5 millimeters. So that means that these filters will be actually very inexpensive to purchase. So for example, if you happen to be using this with black and white film or even infrared film, true infrared film, you would simply attach the filter onto the back of the lens. If I wanted to use this on a Sony digital camera, for example, one of the mirrorless cameras, all I really would need is a small adapter to go from M42 to NEX, which is the E-mount, Sony E-mount. Screw that on, mount this to your camera, and you now have an easily attached 500 millimeter lens. It looks a little bit unusual simply because you have now these two tubes between the body and the lens. One thing that's always common with a mirror lens is that the lens focuses past infinity. And the reason that is because in certain situations, such as sunshine, for example, the lens barrel can heat up and the elements in the lens might shift a little bit. I think that was also true of super telephotos using standard optical elements, not mirrors, back in the film days. That might no longer be true now that we have autofocus lenses. But it's always been very common that you could focus past infinity with these mirror lenses. I have no idea who made this. As you can see, there's no branding other than made in Japan. Well, actually, I guess the brand is Clearview. Never heard of them. I don't even remember how I got this lens. I can't remember if I purchased it specifically because it was a good deal or if it came with something else. Either is possible. Two things. So as you look inside this lens, you can see how that back mirror, you can see how it's concave. I believe that this is just a solid mirror in the front. I don't know that it's concave as well. I can't remember what the true design is for a catadioptric telescope. It's unusual, even though you would think it would create a hole in your photo, it doesn't because of the way that the light is reflected from the back mirror onto this front mirror right here that's rear facing, and then onto your film. So if we look at my board, here is a fairly common construction for these lenses. You have your lens barrel here, and then you have your concave element here. Then of course the front of the lens is here, and then you have this secondary mirror right here. So because this is concave, as the light enters into here, what happens is it bounces up, strikes this mirror, and it comes down through the back of the lens, where the image is then recorded on either film or your digital sensor. Another notable feature of the photographs that this records is your out of focus highlights tend to have holes in them. They're often referred to as donuts, and obviously because you have that circle with a hole in the middle. And so that's a very common phenomenon with these lenses. And so you don't see that with a traditional telephoto lens. What's the advantage of this lens? The advantage is that you can carry a very compact lens with great reach. With some of the mirrorless systems, particularly those with APS sensors, this 500 millimeter lens becomes an effective 750 millimeters. So that's quite a bit of reach. When you shoot one of these, you either want a combination of a high ISO, a monopod, or a tripod. This particular lens has 3 marked aperture settings: f8, then whatever's between f8 and f11, and then f16. So one of the downsides is that these lenses tend to be much slower than the single focal lengths. So for example, this lens, this 200 millimeter lens, its maximum aperture is f4. And that's even considered slow for this type of lens. But of course, this was a lower cost lens, being a Tessar. So, however, it still means that it was 2 stops faster. 2 stops faster with less than half of the reach. F8 means you're probably going to run into some issues when shooting in less than optimal light. So that's why you really need a tripod and or very fast shutter speeds. For a 500 millimeter lens, this lens actually has a pretty decent focusing range, going from infinity, obviously, or slightly past infinity, all the way down to actually less than 1.7 meters. 1.7 meters is 66 inches or 5.5 feet. And that's actually pretty good if you think about a 500 millimeter lens being able to focus down to that degree. And you think, well, maybe I could use this as a portrait lens, and probably not. 500 millimeters, you're going to be right up on top of whoever you're shooting. You probably don't realize it, but yeah, you're going to be shooting their eyeball or their ear, or possibly just their earlobe. This is a great lens for taking photos of the moon. Obviously, you're going to get your best results when you're shooting on a tripod. You could probably do some hand holding. In this photograph, I really wanted to capture some of the clouds passing in front of the moon. And if you notice, the moon is much closer to the Earth in this photo than the previous photo. So in this case, because the moon was so bright, I had to dial in some exposure compensation. In fact, it was minus 2.7 stops, as you can see. I also decided to hand hold this. I ended up taking about 30 shots and maybe 3 or 4 were usable. That goes back to my point that this lens is best used on a tripod. And here's a small video clip showing the donut highlights that I was referring to. I started with, I believe, the lens completely out of focus. Then I slowly turned it through its focusing range before finally setting on a focused portion of this plant that's, I don't know, I think it was about 60 feet away. I did have the camera on a tripod, although you can see, even as I turned the focusing ring, it did introduce some vibrations. I also took a couple photos of some dandelions that are in the yard. And one thing I noticed is for taking these close-up photos, it just didn't seem to do too well. You'll notice as you look at these photos, I'm also going to put up some comparison photos. One was taken with the Carl Zeiss macroplanar, and the other one, the second photo, was taken with a very old Carl Zeiss lens for the first Contax, the Contax 1. In this case, it was a 13.5 centimeter sonar. And that lens probably is from the early 1930s. But in any case, you can see that the resolving power of this lens close up was actually quite poor. I wasn't that impressed with it. Another thing I found is that some of these photos weren't as sharp as I had hoped. It's interesting because the photo shot of the moon at infinity, obviously, appeared to be much sharper. So I'm beginning to think that because this was a lower price lens, it also resulted in lower quality images when I wasn't photographing something at infinity. It does make me interested in perhaps purchasing one of the name brand versions. I see that you can actually buy a Nikkor 500 millimeter lens for not a whole lot of money, so perhaps I'll give that a try. If you're really looking for longer reach, but don't really want to spend that money on that, 4 or 5 or 3, 4 or 500 millimeter lens, or even you don't want to tote around that much, think about getting one of these mirror lenses. You do have limits, and of course there is that issue of out of focus areas showing up as donuts. Otherwise, not a bad choice, and something to consider for your kit. If you've ever used a mirror lens, let me know in the comments below. And if you'd like to see me cover something in the future, also let me know in the comments below, or send me an email at contact@camera-talk.net. And I hope to see you on the next video.